It's 5:05 and welcome into a Thursday edition of the Carolina Journal News Hour. News Talk 1110 99.3 WBT. I'm Nick Craig. Good morning to you. We start with a tragedy in our nation's capital overnight. A jet airliner with 60 passengers and 4 crew members aboard collided Wednesday night around 9 o'clock with an Army helicopter while landing at Ronald Reagan National Airport near Washington. Overnight, over the last 7, 8, 9 hours, this has prompted a large-scale search and rescue operation in the nearby Potomac River, where apparently both aircrafts lay as of this morning. The Federal Aviation Administration says that the mid-air crash occurred around 9 p.m. when a regional jet that had departed from Wichita, Kansas, collided with a military Black Hawk helicopter while on approach to the airport runway. It occurred in some of the most tightly controlled and monitored airspace in the world because it's just 3 miles south of the White House and the U.S. Capitol. The American Airlines Flight 5342 was inbound to Reagan last night at an altitude of just 400 feet and a speed of about 140 miles an hour when it suffered a rapid loss of altitude over the Potomac River, according to data from its radio transponder that tracked it online. It was a CRJ-701 twin-engine jet, which was manufactured in 2004 and can carry a maximum of 70 passengers. A few minutes before landing, air traffic controllers asked the arriving commercial jet if it could land on a shorter runway at Reagan National, and the pilot said they were able to do so. With that, air traffic controllers then cleared the plane to land on runway 33. Flight tracking websites show the plane adjust its approach to the new runway. Less than 30 seconds before the crash, an air traffic controller asks the helicopter if it has the arriving plane in sight. The controller makes another radio call to the helicopter just seconds before the two aircrafts collided mid-air, which was seen on some surveillance video not far away from that. This is still a very dynamic situation, and we are still learning new news and additional details this morning. If we get anything over the next hour, I'll pass it along to you right here on the Carolina Journal News Hour. A tragic situation unfolding in our nation's capital. Turning our attention to our capital this morning, as North Carolina lawmakers did return to Raleigh yesterday to discuss what's next for the state's ongoing response to Hurricane Helene damage in western North Carolina. Democrat Governor Josh Stein's first official actions after being sworn in as governor on the first day of this month was to sign several executive orders targeted at hurricane relief. One order created a new state agency called GROW-NC. That group was set up to handle the work and take over for NCORE, a program that has drawn incredible amounts of criticism for slow and over-budget recovery efforts for hurricanes that affected the eastern half of our state, Hurricanes Florence and Matthew 2016 and 2018. The House Select Committee on Helene Recovery met yesterday afternoon at 2 o'clock to get an update from GROW-NC. The committee, which was led by Representatives John Bell and Dudley Green, kicked off the efforts of this new legislative session to determine how much more to spend and how to spend it. This, of course, all as western North Carolina continues reeling from what was the state's deadliest and most economically damaging disaster in our history, with over 104 people killed in the aftermath and during the process of Hurricane Helene. Representative Dudley Green said this at the beginning of the session yesterday. Recovery efforts are very active, and there's a lot of work for us to do. He then called for a moment of silence before the hearing. During the meeting, we learned about GROW-NC, how the leaders there detailed how the state is prioritizing who first to help, starting with things like income level as well as geographic areas. The leaders of that committee told the General Assembly that they plan to let agencies like the state transportation and environmental departments mostly handle their own work without micromanagement, and instead focus on the GROW-NC efforts of, quote, driving the recovery, coordinating across agencies, and tracking progress. Josh Stein, the new governor, did set up Grow NC to be smaller than other disaster groups in the past, which had ballooned to hundreds of internal employees. He said that was by design. Hearing from leaders in Raleigh yesterday, they said, quote, "We don't want to bog this down with thick layers of bureaucracy. We want to move nimbly." Another top Stein advisor on hurricane recovery, Jonathan Curbs, told the committee that there simply hasn't been enough money set aside for relief, and he urged Republican state lawmakers to ask their GOP colleagues in Congress to push for additional funding. At the state level, Governor Cooper had previously called for the legislature to set aside nearly $4 billion for Hurricane Helene relief. So far, state lawmakers have set aside just over $1 billion. However, we are expecting in the coming weeks that the General Assembly could come up with another relief package, as they are now back in Raleigh full-time. Well, we say full-time for their part-time legislature, and they'll be there pretty much every week for the next couple of months. On Wednesday, a Western North Carolina lawmaker, Haywood County Representative Mark Pless, said he thought the state emergency management department had done a good job considering its limited resources. He urged Stein's advisors to continue regularly telling the legislature what they need to do and how much all of this is going to cost. He said, quote, "I don't want to hear what you're going to do and then find out we have no money and we're really doing nothing but talking about it. I know it doesn't happen overnight, and I know it doesn't happen as quickly as it was destroyed, but so far we haven't moved the needle." That was yesterday in the General Assembly, yesterday afternoon, a lengthy, over almost a 3-hour meeting there. And what we did learn yesterday is that this morning, coming up around 8:30, another legislative oversight committee led by the State House and Senate is scheduled to hear testimony from the head of NCORE, which was the group set up for hurricane relief in the eastern half of the state. And while there continues to be a debate in the Republican-controlled state legislature over exactly how the state should handle Hurricane Helene relief, there is a pretty bipartisan acknowledgement that whatever the state spends will pale in comparison to what the federal government ends up spending. And as, of course, all of this is going on, some pretty drastic changes are possible at the federal level. We continue to follow and discuss FEMA, the Federal Emergency Management Agency. President Donald Trump visiting the state last week and said he's thinking of asking Congress potentially to get rid of FEMA entirely if that agency and that department cannot be overhauled to a situation in which they are able to do their job in an efficient and effective manner. The president has floated the idea of a new system in which, after natural disasters, the federal government would just be the avenue of paying money directly to state governments and have them handle how to spend it instead of FEMA coordinating the efforts. Trump signed an executive order on Monday that attempts to change the way that spending, grants, and other aid programs happen through the Office of Management and Budget. However, it is important to note that that is not having an effect on the relief efforts that continue not only in western North Carolina, but portions of western Florida, and of course now in portions of southern California with those nasty wildfires that wreaked so much havoc over the last couple of weeks. So with the General Assembly gaveling back in yesterday, a busy day for them, and a Hurricane Helene relief, which is going to take years, could be decades before the entire western half of the state is back up and operational, at least the way in which it was before Helene affected that area. Lawmakers seem to be very much on that, and we'll continue to track those details from Grow NC, from NCORE, and from the General Assembly over the next couple of months. We'll have details on our website, carolinajournal.com, and of course keep you up to date here on the Carolina Journal News Hour. Where it's now 5:14, News Talk 1110, 99.3 WBT. It's time to get a look at traffic on this Thursday morning. We'll get the update with Boomer Von Cannon.
Hey, thanks.
It's 5:20. Welcome back to the Carolina Journal News Hour. News Talk 1110 99.3 WBT. If you miss any portion of our program, I encourage you to check out the podcast. It's available 24/7 wherever you get your shows. Just search for the Carolina Journal News Hour. Tap the subscribe and follow button, and you'll get a new show delivered each and every weekday morning. It's the Carolina Journal News Hour podcast. Download and subscribe now. Turning our attention to some more statewide news this morning, Republican State Supreme Court candidate Jefferson Griffin has brought forward a new court filing yesterday in which he claims 500 people who voted in the recent state Supreme Court election have never lived in North Carolina or the United States. That data point surfaced Wednesday in a legal dispute over Griffin's election contest with Democrat Allison Riggs. Griffin initially challenged after the November the 5th election ballots of 267 voters he labeled as never residents. But a series of briefs filed Wednesday in a Wake County Superior Court revealed that Griffin believes the number is significantly higher. As of right now, Riggs leads Griffin by 734 votes out of more than 5.5 million ballots that were cast in the November election. There currently is a temporary stay from the North Carolina Supreme Court, which blocks the State Board of Elections from certifying Riggs as the winner. Griffin has argued that removing unlawful challenged ballots would likely shift the election outcome in his favor. An interesting fact for you, this is the only race in the country that is yet to be called from the November the 5th elections. It's our North Carolina Supreme Court race. In 3 categories of protest, Griffin targets more than 65,000 ballots overall. Riggs and the State Board of Elections are scheduled to respond in writing to Griffin's court filings by the latest on Monday. That's February the 3rd, ahead of a February the 7th Superior Court hearing, which is scheduled in Raleigh to address the election dispute. Griffin's never residents made up the smallest group of voters in his initial ballot challenges. These voters are generally adult children of voters who have had North Carolina residency before moving overseas. Griffin's lawyers wrote in the legal briefing yesterday, quote, "Our state constitution limits voters for state offices to people who have actually resided in North Carolina. Nonetheless, the State Board of Election allowed approximately 267 people to vote in this protested election who have never resided in North Carolina or anywhere else in the United States. These voters self-identify themselves on forms such as stating, quote, 'I am a U.S. citizen living outside the country,' and, quote, 'I have never lived in the United States.' Counting these ballots is unlawful." Griffin's figure of 267 voters was based on data from the State Board of Election for a limited number of counties, according to a footnote in the court filing. So there's still a lot more that is said to go on here as we continue to track the high-stakes race for the North Carolina Supreme Court. We will get some additional legal briefings later this week, and then, early next week on Monday, and then next Friday, a week from tomorrow, we will see that hearing take place in a Wake County Superior Courtroom. We'll track the details right here on the Carolina Journal News Hour, where it's now 5:23, News Talk 1110 99.3 WBT. Yesterday afternoon, the General Assembly really started their 2025 long session with the House and the Senate both gaveling in. Part of that is all of the important committees that do the business of the General Assembly. To get some additional details on that this morning, it's my pleasure to welcome Donna King from CarolinaJournal.com back to the News Hour this morning. Donna, busy day for the House and the Senate. We did learn about some committee assignments within the House. What are you learning about that this morning?
Sure. Good morning. So we're hearing from the new House Speaker, Representative Destin Hall from Caldwell County, that they've made those critical committee decisions. It's kind of a housekeeping thing, but really what it is if you look at the inside baseball crew right around the legislature, lobbyists, think tanks like the John Locke Foundation and reporters, things like that, they like to have that list. Who's going to be on the committee and who's going to be chairing these key committees as they go into this legislative long session. So it seems like it's just sort of in the weeds, inside baseball kind of stuff, but it really does set the tone for what the speaker wants to see coming out of this legislative session.
And for individuals that don't follow state politics all that closely, you see a lot of folks probably see the final vote, something passed the House or something passed the Senate. But Donna, almost all of the time, some of these pieces of legislation, these bills, these new laws, they pass through one, if not multiple committees before they actually make their way to the floor of the House or the Senate. So there's a lot of important work that kind of goes on almost behind the scenes.
Oh, absolutely. We cover this every step of the process for some of these really big bills, but often you really don't hear about it in the general public until it passes a chamber. Key things like that rules chairman of the North Carolina House, that's a traffic cop role. So you may say, okay, well, he just sets the rules. No, what that job really does, which is now going to be Representative John Bell, what that does is it decides, that position can really decide what legislation is going to get heard and what's going to get a vote and what's really going to move forward. We have a little joke, or not really joke, but an understanding among certainly the press that cover the legislature. If something goes to rules, often it goes there to die. So, that is an important role. And so we're seeing John Bell, who really has emerged in the last few years as a real leader in the state legislature. And he will be in that rules chairman position. He works pretty well across the aisle. He's got a good handle on what's going on, but that is an air traffic controller / traffic cop role. So who that rules chairman is really a critical piece of information.
And we covered over the last couple of weeks up at the federal level, Virginia Foxx was put into that similar position in the House. We talked about how important that role was for her in Washington, D.C. I guess it's accurate to say the same thing here in North Carolina.
No question about it. I've covered the Capitol as a reporter, and I've covered the state legislature as a reporter. And there are lots of similarities, but I will say state legislature definitely has more of a Wild West feel. But they also work really closely together. And so you see, just no matter what the party, committee, caucus, division, those kind of things are often worked out in hallways and over coffee and certainly in caucus meetings. But where the rubber hits the road is they are in those committee meetings. And when those agendas come out and when those things get published saying what's going to face a vote, what's going to hit a debate, there's lots of discussion going on behind the scenes, certainly among the members that were announced today.
One of the big topics we'll be following probably through the good chunk of this year is going to be the budget. What's going on over at appropriations? That's kind of where this really starts and at the end of the day ends up finishing in that committee. What's the leadership look like there?
Yeah, no question about it. That is a huge one because the state budget is a big part of what they're going to do there in the long session. So, we watch to see who's heading up the subcommittees, and that's an important one. We're seeing, for example, the appropriations committee has lots of subcommittees. Certainly, the Appropriations Committee is in charge of the budget. So for appropriations, it looks like everybody's on it. And that does happen periodically. It feels like every single member is on it, but it's going to be chaired by Dean Arp. And he really does have an important role in this. He's a good he's a consensus builder kind of person. You have to have that in the appropriations big seat. But you're also seeing for things like in those subcommittees, appropriations for education, for example, Tricia Cotham. She was the one that gave them their supermajority in the last session, switching from Democrat to Republican. So she is a key chair. She is the chair of the Education Appropriations Committee.
Yeah, Donna, as we go through this very busy General Assembly session, we actually saw earlier today a calendar being released, which shows a very aggressive set of weeks and months ahead for the General Assembly. They've got a lot on their plate this year. We'll be talking about hurricane relief and recovery, but all of the other business of the legislature still has to go on at the same time.
Absolutely. No question about it. The budget being the big thing. And it may be that some of these leaders, it is Republican-led chambers by now. So they may be feeding off the energy that they're seeing from the Trump administration. Get these things moving, get them moving quickly. The goal is usually to be out by the end of June. I cannot really think of a time that I've seen that actually happen, but if certainly that's what they hope is going to happen, because this is a part-time legislature. It is really difficult for these members to, raise a family, maintain employment, do all the things that they need to do on the side, because the legislature, being part-time, pays like $13,000 a year plus a per diem for these members. So they really have to be employed outside. So making it a part-time legislature is difficult for these members. There may be, as a John Locke Foundation and Carolina Journal, we've talked about, they need to limit the number of days that are in session. They need to really think about some of those legislative reforms to make it easier for people to serve. Right now, it's difficult.
Very difficult. Donna, we've got the list of every committee and every person assigned to it. Where can folks get those details this morning?
Absolutely. Head over to carolinajournal.com, and that whole list, basically, we just took exactly what Speaker Hall put out and we put it right on our website for everybody to look at.
The editor-in-chief of Carolina Journal, Donna King, joins us this morning on the Carolina Journal News Hour. Where it's now 5:30, News Talk 1110, 99.3 WBT. It's time for another look at traffic on this Thursday morning with Boomer Von Cannon.
Hey, thank you.
It's 5:36. Welcome back to the Carolina Journal News Hour. News Talk 1110 99.3 WBT. Turning our attention to Washington, D.C. now, U.S. Senator Ted Budd alongside Senator Thom Tillis have introduced a bill in the United States Senate that would allow public assistance funding from the Federal Emergency Management Agency to be used for permanent repairs of private roads and bridges that Hurricane Helene destroyed in western North Carolina. As it says right in the name, private roads and bridges normally do not have access to federal funding. However, the Restoring Access to the Mountain Home Act would reimburse local and state government officials for repair costs of the only access that many mountain homes have to main roads and highways. Currently, FEMA's individual assistance program is capped at $42,500, and that's for all expenses. That amount is often exceeded by the cost of rebuilding private roads and bridges, and North Carolina is estimating nearly a $350 million gap between what is funded and what is required to rebuild in terms of private bridges and roads that, as I just mentioned, are relied on by many of mountainous regions, not in just North Carolina, but that's obviously where our focus is this morning. Senator Ted Budd said in a press release, quote, "Mountain homes often require private roads and bridges to connect their property to main roads and highways. Given FEMA's individual assistance cap and the extensive cost of rebuilding these access points, I am proud to propose a bill that would allow the people of western North Carolina to use public assistance dollars to regain access to their homes." U.S. Representative Chuck Edwards introduced a similar piece of legislation in the House that was also co-sponsored by U.S. Representative Don Davis and former House Speaker, now Congressman Tim Moore. Edwards said in a press release that private roads make up almost half of all roads in western North Carolina, according to data from the North Carolina Office of State Budget and Management, and it is estimated that Hurricane Helene damaged over 7,000 of those private roads, bridges, and culverts. Again, private, not state-funded, not county or municipality funded. Edwards said in a press release, "Every disaster response official I've heard from agrees on one thing. Hurricane Helene destroyed the greatest number of private roads and bridges that they've ever seen in one disaster. We're entering month 6 since Helene hit our mountains, and there are still folks with limited access to many of our mountain homes. The Restoring Access to Mountain Home Act would ease the burden of western North Carolina families by allowing NCDOT and local governments to be reimbursed by FEMA for any repairs that they make to private roads or bridges." NCDOT gave an update earlier this month on the status of closed roads and bridges. As of January the 21st, 1,426 roads were closed. However, 1,125 roads have reopened since the storm in late September. They also noted that there's over 9,300 damaged sites or portions of roadways, including 83 bridges and as well as 867 culverts were identified due to have the most destruction from the storm. It is also estimated that approximately 145 bridges, both public and private, will likely require some form of replacement. With that, we will track the movement of this legislation in the House and the Senate. The progress for that will be House, Senate, and then over to the President's desk for a signature. We'll continue to track those details. You can read more on the story. Teresa Opeka's got it this morning at CarolinaJournal.com, and we'll keep you up to date right here on the Carolina Journal News Hour. It's now 5:40. News Talk 1110 99.3 WBT. We've got an update this morning on some campaign finances as it relates to the November 2024 election, the race for governor between Republican Lieutenant Governor Mark Robinson and, at the time, Democrat Attorney General Josh Stein. Some pretty eye-popping amounts of money raised by the Stein campaign. To get some additional details on that this morning, it's my pleasure to welcome Katie Zender, CarolinaJournal.com, to the News Hour this morning. Katie, you've got a bunch of big numbers in your story. Will you walk us through some of those this morning?
Yeah, good morning, Nick. So Stein's fundraising efforts more than quadrupled Robinson's in the fundraising efforts. Stein raised more than $83.7 million, whereas Robinson raised just under a quarter of that at $20 million. So quite the bloodbath in terms of fundraising.
Yeah, and as you look at this for individuals that spend any time on social media or watching TV throughout the election in the middle and latter parts of last year, Katie, it was pretty hard to hide away from the messaging, specifically from the Stein campaign that was relentless in beating up on Mark Robinson. And I guess they raised all that money, they put it to use.
Right, exactly. And the third quarter reports that we reported on, back right just a few weeks before the election, reflect this same disparity gap. Whereas in the third quarter, which is where the big money drops usually come, we see that same gap between Stein and Robinson. Stein far outraised Robinson in the third quarter. And we also see this reflected in the poll numbers from the October Carolina Journal poll, where Stein led Robinson at 43.4%, with Robinson only at 28.9%. And then, of course, we see that reflected in the final election results, where Stein led Robinson with a 14% margin. Stein had 54.9% of the vote, with Robinson only at 40.08% of the vote.
There's often discussions that go on in political circles now, the difference between things like grassroots support and money. And some individuals think you can do it with one, you don't need the other. But Katie, I think as we're discussing this morning, even as strong as somebody like Mark Robinson's grassroots support was, to overcome that disparity, as you mentioned, 4-1 in terms of fundraising, is really, really hard to do. You've got to raise that money and be able to get your message out there.
Right, and almost half of Stein's receipts or donations came from party contributions. His receipts from party contributions totaled $39.7 million, which is almost double Robinson's total fundraising amount. Stein also received $43.4 million in individual contributions. Those are exactly what they sound like. They're contributions from individual donors, often small amounts, 10, 15, 20, 25, 50 amounts, sometimes larger, but often smaller amounts. And they're broken down between in-state, out-of-state, and undisclosed contributions. Undisclosed means we don't know if they're in-state or out-of-state. But Stein received $30.2 million in in-state contributions, $43.4 million total, $30.2 million in-state, $11.4 million out-of-state, and $1.7 million in undisclosed contributions. Whereas Robinson, his receipts included $14.8 million in-state, $2.2 million out-of-state, and $1.5 million undisclosed.
This out-of-state money is interesting. This is something that's been kind of brewing behind the scenes for the last couple of years. There's been a lot of criticism specifically pointed at the Democrat Party and Democrats in the state, Katie, about these large sums of money that they're raising from out of state. And by looking at those numbers that you're going over, half of the money that Mark Robinson raised, Josh Stein raised literally in out-of-state contributions, people that do not necessarily have any direct ties or vested interest in what's going on here in North Carolina. That's going to be something that's interesting to follow in the years to come.
Right. And a lot of these, out-of-state donors are big donors, people that, donated millions and millions of dollars. So we can see a lot of this coming from, especially to Stein's campaign. It comes from the NC Democratic Party and the Democratic Leadership Committee as well.
It's interesting when we talk about political campaigns. I mentioned kind of TV and social media, but mail is a huge piece of the campaign. Everybody's mailboxes were full. Every day you'd run down to the mailbox to find 5, 6, 8 different sort of political pamphlets put in there. That's still something that is being spent on. And Katie, that stuff compared to some other forms of advertising is still very expensive.
Right, exactly, Nick. Mailers is something that all campaigns spend a ton of money on, and I don't think a lot of people pay attention to them. Even if they don't know how they're voting, I feel like most people throw them away, but it's something that campaigns do spend a lot of money on, and they're just, they're so expensive. This is part of, the Republicans' push in the last couple of years to get more voters to vote early. That's something that Democrats are very, very good at, is voting early, but Republicans not so much. But the more people that vote early, once you voted, they take you off their list. So they're going to stop sending you mailers, they're going to stop calling you, they're going to stop emailing you. So that really saves the campaign a lot of money when the voters do vote early, and they can stop sending out these mailers and all these things.
Katie, there's a lot more that we don't have a chance to get into this morning. You've got some different charts and figures in your article this morning. Where can folks find details on that?
Yeah, people can read the full article, check out all the campaign reports, and look at the charts at carolinajournal.com.
Katie Zender joins us this morning on the Carolina Journal News Hour. It's now 5:46, News Talk 1110, 99.3 WBT. Time for another look at traffic this morning. We'll get the update with Boomer Von Cannon.
Hey, Nick. You were hot.
Good morning again. It's 5:51. You're listening to the Carolina Journal News Hour on News Talk 1110 and 99.3 WBT. Recapping our breaking story, a tragic situation unfolding in our nation's capital this morning as a jet airliner with 60 passengers and 4 crew members aboard collided Wednesday night with an Army helicopter while attempting to land at Ronald Reagan National Airport near Washington, D.C. And in the overnight hours, and as we speak this morning, large-scale search and rescue operations do continue in the freezing nearby Potomac River. The Federal Aviation Administration said that the midair crash occurred around 9 p.m. last night when a regional jet that had departed from Wichita, Kansas, collided with a military Black Hawk helicopter while on approach to an airport runway. It occurred in some of the most tightly controlled and monitored airspace in the world, as the Reagan International Airport sits just 3 miles south of the White House and the U.S. Capitol. The American Airlines Flight 5342 was inbound to Reagan National at an altitude of just 400 feet. As it was approaching the airport, that's when, according to flight data available online, it suffered a rapid loss of altitude over the Potomac River. It was a CRJ 701 twin jet airline that was manufactured in 2004 and can carry a maximum of 70 passengers. There was a helicopter in that area, according to air traffic control audio that was made available. The air traffic controllers were attempting to call and communicate with the helicopter, only to have just moments later those two aircrafts collide mid-air. As of right now, this is still a very dynamic situation. We continue to track the details, and you'll hear about it throughout the day right here on News Talk 1110 and 99.3 WBT. Turning our attention back to the state this morning. Yesterday afternoon, North Carolina lawmakers were in Raleigh essentially to kick off the 2025 legislative session and discuss really one of the main topics, what's going to happen next for the state's ongoing response to Hurricane Helene out in the western half of North Carolina. There is a group set up called Grow NC, which was started by now Democratic Governor Josh Stein. It was one of his first official actions after being sworn in earlier this month. He signed a plethora of executive orders surrounding Helene. One of them was to create this new state agency. Grow NC is going to hopefully fix what was a mess in Rebuild NC, or NCORE, which was a program that was started under Democrat Governor Roy Cooper that has a $300+ million budget deficit, and as of last check, had more than 1,400 individuals that were still waiting for their homes to be repaired or replaced from hurricanes that affected the state in 2016 and 2018. Yesterday, the House Select Committee on Helene Recovery met to get an early update from the Grow NC leaders. One of those individuals, Matt Calabria, who is a former Wake County commissioner and was picked by Stein to lead some of those efforts. The committee itself is led by Representatives John Bell and Dudley Green, and it was a lengthy hearing yesterday, about 3 hours or so. Individuals from Grow NC, individuals from North Carolina Emergency Management, all providing an update to lawmakers. And what we learned, really the high-level conversation, the high-level talking points coming out of that meeting is that it is going to take a lot of money to, of course, complete all of these recovery and relief efforts. We did learn that Grow NC is prioritizing individuals first by looking at things like income level as well as their geographic area. They did note that they plan on letting other state agencies like transportation and environmental departments to handle their own work and not get into the weeds and micromanage them. Instead, they're going to be focusing on Grow NC's efforts, which is driving recovery and coordinating cross-agency work as well as tracking the progress in the western half of the state. Speaking of ENCOR, the group that was responsible under Roy Cooper for hurricane relief in the eastern half of the state, coming up in just a couple of hours this morning, another legislative oversight committee, which is led by both state House and Senate Republicans, will hear from ENCOR again more years after questions continue to swirl around the work that they had completed and the work that they have still not completed. On the last update, we learned that the agency was about $350 million in the red in regards to money that they had already spent, that they had pre-allocated, and that more than 1,400 individuals were still waiting for their homes. We'll be tracking that committee hearing early this morning over at CarolinaJournal.com, and I'll have the latest for you coming up tomorrow morning right here on the Carolina Journal News Hour. One of the big takeaways, of course, is that this is going to take a lot of time and a lot of money to get those folks put back together in the western half of the state. We'll continue to track details on the Carolina Journal News Hour. That's going to do it for a Thursday edition. WBT News is next, followed by Good Morning BT. We are back tomorrow morning, 5 to 6 a.m. right here on News Talk 1110 and 99.3 WBT.